guys, welcome back to my channel. So today is Advent day number 18, and for this video I'm going to be talking through how I drew this red rose in colour pencils and markers. So for this tutorial I'm going to be using the Promarkers by Winsor & Newton, and the colour pencils I'm using are the Faber Castell Polychromos, and I'm going to be using a couple of Caran Luminance colour pencils as well. But I'll write down all the colours I'm using and I'll put FC next to the Faber Castell ones and CD next to the Caran ones, so you know which set they're from. So to start off with the tutorial, I drew out a sketch of the rose. So I'm not going to talk through how I drew the sketch, it's going to be more about how I'm going to colour it to make it look realistic. But when I have my sketch, I want it to be quite light, so I took a bit of sticky tape and I pressed that against the whole of the sketch, and it really just lifts off the layer of the pencil and lightens it, but you can still see all of the pencil strokes underneath. And then I just went and darkened it a bit more so that you could see on the camera the sketch, because you need to see it in order to really understand this tutorial. So for this tutorial I'm going to be using 3 marker pens, and I'm just going to list them up the top here. So again, I'm using the Winsor & Newton Promarkers, and I'm using the shades Poppy, Crimson and Burgundy. So I've got a light tone, a mid tone and a darker tone there. And what I'm using these markers for is really to do a base layer to indicate where the shadows are and where the highlights are in this rose. So I'm not using them to get the detail, I'm just using them to mark in where those shadows are and where the highlights are. It's really important to pay close attention to your reference photo when you're doing this, so you can accurately put in where your shadows are. It tends to be that the shadows on the rose are the parts that are covered up, or the parts where if you have a petal that's overlapping it, the petal that's being overlapped should have a shadow cast on it. Also in the middle, like the centre of the rose where it's more enclosed, it tends to be darker in that region as well. So the process that I'm using to do this is I'm applying the lightest colour first, so that poppy, to the whole of the petal, and then I'm going in with the mid-tone, which is the crimson, and I'm using that to transition into the shadow, and then I'm using the burgundy on the darkest parts of the shadow, so on the inner parts of the petal. And as you can see, it makes it look a lot more three-dimensional. So I continue to do that with each petal. So I add the poppy colour, and then I add the crimson on the shadows, and then I use the burgundy on the main darkest parts of that petal. As you can see, there is a pattern to where the shadows are, so the shadows tend to be on the inner parts of the petals, and then the outer parts of the petals tend to be more of the highlighted regions, because that's where the light can hit. So for this tutorial I am using the Strathmore Toned Tan paper, and the only problem with this is that when you're using markers, the markers do bleed through the paper quite a bit. So if you're using this in the sketchbook, make sure you put something behind it, otherwise the markers will bleed onto the next few pages in your sketchbook, and you don't want to waste all your paper. So put a layer of tracing paper behind it, or just another piece of paper, or take the sheet out of the sketchbook and draw on it separately. So if you're new to roses, then I definitely recommend that you use reference photos when you're doing this, and use a few different reference photos of roses and look at where the shadows are, and you should be able to see a pattern, and then use these reference photos until you feel like you've got a good grasp on the concept of where the shadows and the highlights are. Or it's not bad to use reference photos, so if you still want to use the reference photo, all it's going to do is make your work look more realistic, because you're not imagining the detail that's going to be there. However, it's always great to have a good concept of where the shadows are anyway, so you understand it rather than just copying it. So I did do a video yesterday talking about how I use markers under colour pencils, so if you haven't seen that, definitely go and check it out. And I did get a lot of comments asking about how the light fastness ratings apply to markers compared to colour pencils. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that right now. So for marker pens, they aren't as light fast as some of the colour pencils are that I'm using. So they do tend to fade a lot more over time. So markers in general aren't as light fast. So I had people asking whether this meant that when you use them in combination, the markers underneath are going to fade more. And generally, because the markers aren't on display, they're being covered by the coloured pencils, then you won't see a lot of change over time from your drawing, because you've got that coloured pencil covering it. So it depends, if the coloured pencil fades, then it's going to look more faded. But if you've got large chunks of your markers that are showing through, like I tend to cover a lot of my marker up with the coloured pencil, so there might just be the microscopic dot that isn't covered up. So if that fades, then you're not even going to tell that it's faded. But if you're using leaving large portions of your drawings with just the marker and then just adding coloured pencils to parts of it, then you might see that the markers fade a lot more than the coloured pencils, and it might look a bit weird. So you've got to bear in mind that. So it's important to look up also the light fastness for your markers as well. But like coloured pencils, there's coloured pencil brands where they're not light fast, like the Prismacolors. A lot of them have really bad light fastness ratings. So just do a bit of research into the light fastness for different marker brands so you can pick the right one. Generally, I only use this technique for like fan art and stuff like that. Stuff that I'm selling, I don't really use markers for. I use more watercolour and coloured pencils, so I use the watercolours as an underbase. However, if you did want to sell your work with the markers, then definitely look into the light fastness ratings and try and find the best one for your budget. Okay, so now I've moved on to using the coloured pencil, and I'm using this in the same way that I use the markers. So I've got a lighter shade and a mid-tone and some darker shades, and I've also got a black from the Caran dash, and I've got the crimson from the Caran dash as well, and I've also got a white for the highlights. So I'm using it in the same sort of way, so I'm using the darker colour for the shadows, and then I'm using the lighter one for the highlights, and I'm also using the white for the highlights as well. And I'm just going to do this in layers. So I've started by indicating where all the highlights are on the actual flower, and then I'm going to be going in and softening that out by adding lots of layers of the other colours as well over the top of those markers. So I'm using the dark red and the crimson for the shadows, and I'm using that with the black on the very, very darkest parts of the flower. I'm trying not to use the black too much, but only really on the darkest parts of this flower. And then I'm using the deep red for the mid-tones, so to transition from that dark red into where the lighter regions are. And the scarlet red and the white are more where the highlighted regions are on the flower. So I mark where all the highlights are over all the petals, and then I start working on it petal at a time. So when I use the black colour pencil, I always go over it with the crimson alizarin from Caran dash, because it's a wax-based pencil, so to blend out that black you need to apply another wax-based pencil over the top, otherwise the Faber Castell pencils wouldn't have blended it out and it just looks black. So if you apply that red Caran dash colour pencil, it will really smooth it out and lighten it so it's not such a harsh black colour. And then I use the Faber Castell and the Caran dash to transition from those shadows into those lighter tones. Again, make sure that you pay close attention to your reference photos, especially for the veins of the flowers, so the little lines on each petal, make sure that you look to see the direction in which they are going in. So make sure you also look at your reference photo to look at the direction that the veins are going in on each of the petals, because if you get the curvature of those lines right, then it can make the flower look a lot more three-dimensional. I also am tending to use that scarlet red colour to blend all the colours together, so I do a final layer of this and the deep red over the petals just to get the colours to soften and smooth into one another, and just to add a general tone across the flower. So it's really important to apply the colour pencil in layers to really build up the depth into the drawing. So even if you think you've finished certain parts of the drawing, keep looking back across the whole drawing to see if the certain bits of the shadows are dark enough, and then you might have to go in and just darken other bits just to make sure the contrast in the flower is correct, so the contrast between the shadows and the lighter tones is good. So once I've added the basic red colours across all of the petals, I go in once again with that white colour and I pick out the highlights in each of the petals. And I'm doing this using the direction that the veins on the petals are going to help add 3-dimension to the piece. And then I'm going to go back in and blend that out a bit more so it's not as harsh. So then I just quickly went in with the Caran blender that you get in the set, and I used that just to smooth over the colours into each other to give it more of a smoother look. So what I really like about the Faber Castell Polychromos is that they have such a sharp edge that you can easily get some really crisp petals. And also what's really nice about this Strathmore Toned Tan paper is that because it's slightly toned, I can then go and outline the whole flower with this white pencil and kind of add a background glow to it that really stands out and brings it out of the paper. So this paper is really nice to draw cartoons on and stuff like that, which you really want to make pop out of the paper. Anyway guys, that's it for this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave it a like and also give it a share. That would really help me out. If you're new to my channel, feel free to subscribe so that you don't miss out on my future speed drawings and tutorial videos. As always, I'll leave the links to my social media sites in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.